Russian forces have launched a major military attack on Ukraine on the orders of Russian President Vladimir Putin. Tanks and troops have poured into Ukraine at points along its eastern, southern, and northern borders, and explosions have been heard across the country. But the real question is, why is Ukraine being invaded, and what might Russia want from its neighbouring country? To make sense of the current crisis, we must understand the history of the relationship between the two inextricably linked countries, which dates to at least the 9th century. Ukrainian independence. With the collapse of the Russian monarchy in 1917, under the strain of war and political discord, patriotic Ukrainians established their coordinating body, the Central Rada, which soon developed into a revolutionary parliament. The Russian Provisional Government granted Ukraine autonomy under the name of the Ukrainian People's Republic, UNR, but the Bolsheviks subsequently refused to recognize it and invaded Ukraine in order to include it in the Soviet state. The UNR declared full independence in January of 1918 and signed a peace treaty with the Central Powers in Brest before the Bolsheviks did the exact same. The German authorities installed the Ukrainian monarch under the historic title of Hetman, but the UNR returned to power after the end of the First World War and proclaimed unification with the Ukrainian lands of the former Austro-Hungarian Empire. The UNR could not survive the titanic clash between the Russian Reds and Whites during the Russian Civil War, which lasted from 1917 to 1922, as neither power recognized Ukrainian sovereignty, but the President of Ukrainian independence forced the Bolsheviks to create a Soviet Ukrainian Republic, which in 1922 became a founding member of the Soviet Union. However, in the early 1930s, Stalin returned to the unfinished task of crushing the Ukrainian political nation, which developed during the revolution. Some 4 million Ukrainian peasants perished in the state-engineered famine of 1932, which in Ukraine is known as a Holodomor, which simply translates to murder through starvation, and it is considered a genocide, an interpretation increasingly accepted worldwide, but which Russia rejects. Stalin also destroyed the Ukrainian cultural elite and began promoting the Tsarist notion of Ukrainians as a Russian's younger brother. Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. Following up on his agreement with Hitler on the division of East Central Europe between them, Stalin invaded Poland in September of 1939 and incorporated into the Ukrainian SSR the Ukrainian lands that Poland had kept after its brief war with the Bolsheviks in 1919, a stalemate which ended Lenin's dream of the Red Cavalry bringing the revolution to Europe. At the Yalta Conference in 1945, Winston Churchill and Roosevelt allowed Stalin to keep these territories. The Soviets also pressured Czechoslovakia into giving up its Russian lands. The resulting enlarged Ukrainian SSR came to incorporate nearly all the territories with an ethnic Ukrainian majority under its energetic party boss Nikita Khrushchev. Khrushchev thereby achieved a long-standing aim of Ukrainian patriots to create a united Ukraine, but pursued a course of cultural assimilation into Russia rather than promoting Ukrainian autonomy. Armed resistance to Soviet rule by Ukrainian nationalists in the formerly Polish territories continued into the 1950s. Crimean Peninsula. Although attached by land only to Ukraine, Crimea became an autonomous republic within Russia in 1921, partly because of the peninsula's strategic significance. Neither Russians nor Ukrainians constituted a majority there, and in the 1920s, the Soviets cultivated the culture of the Crimean Tatars, who had lived on the peninsula since the 13th century and whose Crimean Khanate the Russian Empire conquered in 1783 to impress the Western colonies and newly independent states in Asia with their seemingly benevolent policies. When the Red Army retook Crimea from Nazi Germany in 1944, however, Stalin ordered a forced deportation of the Tatars, which many historians consider a genocidal. As a result of this deportation, ethnic Russians became a numerical majority virtually overnight. The war had left the peninsula's economy and cities in ruins. To mark the 300 years since Pryaslav, Khrushchev organized a transfer of Crimea to the Ukrainian SSR, which was to rebuild it and supply it with fresh water through a major channel to be constructed. He also hoped to gratify the Ukrainian bureaucrats, compromising his power base, and perhaps to add a culturally Russian counterweight to the recently incorporated nationalistic Western regions. Collapse of the Soviet Union. When Mikhail Gorbachev's loosening of ideological controls resulted in the mass rejection of Soviet communism, Ukrainian and Russian democratic activists worked together to usher in the new politics such as freedom of speech and free elections. Russian President Boris Yeltsin's administration did not try to preserve the Soviet Federation, but rather sought an independent Russia. This made Yeltsin a natural ally of President Leonid Khrushchev of Ukraine, but only as long as both rejected the Soviet legacy. The Ukrainian referendum in December of 1991 spelled the end of the Union, and Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus initiated its former dissolution. However, with economic reforms stalling in the early 1990s, Yeltsin and other Russian figures increasingly appealed to domestic nationalists nostalgic for the Soviet Empire by criticizing Ukrainian cultural policies and questioning the transfer of Crimea. In 1997, a comprehensive treaty between Russia and Ukraine affirmed the integrity of the Ukrainian borders, something that Russia and the Western nuclear powers also guaranteed in the Budapest Memorandum of 1994, when Ukraine agreed to surrender its Soviet-made nuclear arsenal, Crimea and Donbass. When a popular revolution in Ukraine removed the pro-Russian president Viktor Yanukovych and brought to power pro-Western democratic forces, an act approved by the parliament and confirmed by snap presidential elections, the Russian authorities took advantage of the turmoil to establish military control over Crimea. They calculated that the local Russian majority would support the peninsula's incorporation into Russia, attracted by higher salaries and better career options without the need to study Ukrainian. But the sham referendum on joining Russia produced implausible results, and the world community, aside from a few pro-Russian outliers like North Korea, Syria, and Venezuela, decisively condemned the annexation. Facing punitive Western sanctions, Russian authorities in Crimea began to repress local Ukrainian and Crimean Tatar activists. Having ensured its control over Crimea, Russia also fomented rebellions in other southeastern Ukrainian provinces, where the dominant regional parties have long cultivated pro-Russian attitudes. But this strategy only worked in the Donbass, a depressed industrial region with a Russian-speaking majority. When Ukrainian troops tried to re-establish control, Vladimir Putin's administration covertly sent regular army units to support the pro-Russian separatists and Russian volunteers. The active phase of the war lasted until the fall of 2015, with renewed escalation in 2017 and early 2020, resulting in an estimated human cost of 14,000 killed and an estimated 1.5 million displaced.